And welcome, everybody, to another amazing week right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. This week, it will be all about the budget. We're going to take a look at that sweet, sweet budget. By sweet, I mean large, very large, of course, budget always is. Tens of billions of dollars being spent here by Kentucky governments. We'll be going over exactly what was rolled out. Exactly, is it good? Is it bad? Well, it's a mixed bag of both. Honestly, since I've been covering them spending money so far, this has been one of the better budgets, even though it does have a fairly large increase in overall spending. We will dig through all of that because there's a lot of terminology, a lot to understand when it comes to analyzing the budget. So if you want to learn more about the budget, you want to learn how the budget works, you are hoping to learn and get a little more insight so you don't just have to rely on those politicians that have a reason, maybe, to misrepresent what's going on to you, well, you've come to the right place because that's what we'll be discussing today. Before I dig down into it, please make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe, of course. Make sure you're telling people about the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Not a lot of shows out there doing this. I don't know of a single other show that's going to be taking the time to go through the budget in this way and really putting together this is about a 45-minute show or so, taking time to put together and explain to you exactly everything that is happening with your tax dollars in the state. I think it's important information, so I hope you can join me in sharing that out there and hopefully spread the word. If you're listening on radio or TV, please head over to theandrewshow.com. You can check out where to listen to the podcast in case you miss an episode. But without further ado, let's dig down into it. So here's the top line. So the budget comes out, and as always, it's a little bit of a hurried process. Let's just go over the budget process. So the budget originates in the House, and it's made every 2 years. So when they make the budget, they're making it for 2 years. Other than during COVID, they did a few one-year budgets, but during their what they call long sessions, that's the even years, they have 60 session days versus the odd years, they only have 30 session days. They go ahead and use that extra time to decide how we're spending the tens of billions of dollars that the taxpayers are giving them. So that's first thing to understand. So when I start talking about numbers, how I talk about numbers within the budget is I look at what they're spending yearly, but sometimes they spend more 1 year and more the other and less the next year. That's typically how it works. So what I like to do is just take the average of the 2 years and then just look at, on average, this is how much they are spending. So it originates in the House. They create a budget document. In this case, they normally just kind of roll out the budget and it's a surprise. They introduce it the same day that it's heard in committee, and then it gets passed out of committee, and then the next day it is passed out of the House. Now, they do that quick succession, and they kind of did the same thing this year with committee to House right away in order to prevent a lot of amendments being added onto the bill and then having to take some votes on them. For an example, how that works is there's House rules, Senate rules that say an amendment has to exist for a certain amount of time before it can be heard on a bill. So if you pass the bill and then you vote to suspend the rules to allow the bill to just pass in the House the next day, because typically the rules are that a bill has to be read into the record for 2 days, and on the third day they can vote on it. That gives you time to go ahead and file the amendments and it to exist within the correct amount of time for the House rules for the amendment to be heard by the floor. However, if you do vote to suspend the rules, you can bring a bill up that has just passed out of committee immediately to be voted on, and of course that's what they do because they don't want to have debates on amendments put forward by the Democrats mainly, because honestly, politically speaking, it can be a little iffy. I mean, if Democrats sit there and they say, okay, I'm going to propose an amendment that we're going to spend some ridiculous amount, I want to say $1 billion on, I don't know, free food for kids or something. Like, we're going to feed every single child in Kentucky, all on taxpayers' dime. The parent doesn't have to feed them at all. We're going to spend $1 billion on that. Well, obviously, we don't have that kind of money. And also, is that the proper role of government? Should the government be taking care of every single kid within the state and making and feeding them and everything else? Or should that fall to the parents? If you're a conservative, if you're a Republican, obviously the answer is the parents should be taking care of their own children. They are their children. But that amendment gets filed. And if it has to be voted on, the actual amendment voted on, then people necessarily will have to vote no, but now during campaign season, you have to deal with campaign ads attacking you for not wanting to feed kids. That's how it works. That's politics for you. So that's why they rush it through. What they did this year a little bit different is they proposed first a bare bones budget bill. Then they had some hearings about various parts and funding within the bill. And then they put forward what's called a committee sub. So basically, it just replaced the whole bill with a new bill. They introduced that committee sub the same day as the House Appropriations and Revenue budget hearing. Then it passes. Then the next day, they passed it out of the House. So this budget's already passed out of the House. It'll now go to the Senate, where the Senate committee will go through it. They may make some changes, put in their own committee sub. They most likely will. Then the Senate will vote on it immediately. Same reasoning to prevent amendments being filed to it. And then since the two versions most of the time, like 100% of the time, disagree, they then have what's called a budget conference committee, where the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee come together. They have meetings and hearings about what the actual final budget will be. But generally speaking, what gets passed out of the House gives you a pretty good idea of exactly what it will end up officially being. And the budget that was passed out of the House, now they made a lot of claims about wanting to cut spending. I know I covered it. I said, look, they're making a lot of claims about cutting spending. They're saying the Bashir administration isn't really providing them a lot of documents, isn't working with them on the budget. They're going to want to cut spending just to show them, hey, if you're not going to work with us, we're just going to make our best educated guess. And our educated guess is we need to cut everything. So we're going to make some cuts. That's not what we exactly got. So to understand, so overall, the budget as a whole actually went up a full 21% over the prior budget. So they are spending 21% more. 21.8 exactly. 21.8% more. That's a top line stat you need to know. Now, what's interesting is you're going to hear a lot of legislators say, no, we kept spending even, or we spent exactly the same amount we did last year. Or, when you account for inflation, we actually cut spending because it only went up a few million. And you'll be like, oh, hold on here. Andrew's telling me it went up 21.8%. What's the difference? Well, you have to understand the terminology they're using, and a little bit of it is meant to be confusing. A little bit of it is meant to, throw you off so they can make these claims. And a little bit of it is actually them being honest to a degree about what they have control over and what they don't. Because there's a few terms when you're looking at the budget you have to understand. One is, what is the general fund? What are restricted funds? What are federal funds? What are bond funds? And then you've got tobacco settlement funds, road funds, other funds, okay? So to understand, the general fund is like the giant pot of money. It's the one the legislature has the most amount of, quote unquote, control over. But even that isn't exactly accurate because they actually have control over almost all of it. The only thing they don't have control over how much is coming in exactly is the federal funds, because obviously that's determined by the federal government, but they do have a lot of leeway in how they go ahead and decide to spend those federal funds. So what do all those terms mean? We'll be discussing that when we come back to explain those terms so that way you can understand when your legislator looks at you and says, we passed the most fiscal budget that's ever existed on the face of this planet. We didn't even spend more money. We kept spending even. So when you account for inflation, we actually cut the budget. You're welcome. You know exactly what they're talking about because it does get rather confusing. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the bads. Obviously, the overall increase in spending, we're doubling the amount of debt we're going into. We'll discuss that. But then also the goods. There is cuts. There is limitations put in place. They are doing some things that hold Bashir accountable. So we'll be discussing all that when we get back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Delicious. Oh, what's in here? Oh, well, what's in my tumbler here, the Andrew Cooperrider Show tumbler, available for sale at brewed.store. is 1776, a brewed coffee, a Kentucky Proud product that's roasted right here in Kentucky, of course. You can pick yourself up a bag at brewed.store. Free shipping on orders over $85. And they're sold in per pound, both ground, whole bean, and K-cups. If you like your little K-cup machines, we have that for you too. And the best part is per pound, it's cheaper than most of the boutique freedom-loving coffees out there. And this one's made right here in your own backyard. I know that's fantastic. So pick yourself up. We've got 1776, a French roasted dark blend, which is historically funny because, of course, the French financed the revolution. And then also we have one of our other signature blends, Tyrant's Tears, a coffee that we meticulously harvest from famous tyrants like Annie Bashir, Pol Pot, and, of course, Mao. Additionally, we have other single origin coffees such as Cameroon Pea Berry, Kenya, Peru. Fantastic, fantastic blends. Go ahead and pick yourself up a bag today. Not only will you be supporting the show, but also you'll be putting in your mouth a delicious and tasty black nectar called coffee. So order yours today. Brewed.store. Once again, it's BREWED.store. Brewed.store. Free shipping. Orders over $85. Pick yourself up a bag and pick yourself up one of these spiffy tumblers. Andrew Cooperrider Show tumbler today. Once again, that's brewed.store. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. As I said in the last segment, we'll be digging through exactly what all these terms mean in the budget as far as the different funds go. I think this is incredibly important. This might be one of those episodes that some of you might find kind of boring just because I'm being the extremely explanatory Andrew that some of you know and love and some of you don't find as entertaining. But I just think it's incredibly important to understand exactly what's going on. And even then, you have to understand too, even as I go through this, there are a lot of legislators that don't exactly understand the difference here. So you have the general fund, right? And that's what they're talking about. And they say, look, we didn't spend more. We actually spent less when you count for inflation. So the general fund is the big pot of money where income tax and sales tax generally flows into. And technically, the legislature has a lot more control over that than they do over something like restricted funds. So all these funds are different based upon their source. That's what's important to understand. It doesn't have a lot to do with how it has to be spent. You'll hear people say things like, the restricted funds or the road fund must be spent on the roads, or that the restricted funds, and I'll go over exactly what all their sources are, that the restricted funds have to be spent on those specific items. But who made that rule? It isn't in the state constitution. This is a statutory rule. It was made up by the legislature to say statutorily that money has to go there. But here's the thing. When the legislature makes law, it cannot violate other law. And I don't mean that it can't do it, like physically once they pass a law saying you can't spend this money anywhere else, that holds true. What I mean is if any law conflicts with the law that they are passing, in this case, if there's any law that conflicts with the budget they are passing, then that law is overwrote by the new law. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. So the legislature does not have to follow the state law when passing bills. They only have to follow the state constitution. So what does the state constitution say about the budget? Not much. The main point you need to know about the state constitution is that it says a few things. One, that we have a balanced budget amendment. What that means is, generally speaking, the money spent for the operation of the government has to be gathered through tax revenues. They cannot go into debt as a state and just outright borrow money to go ahead and fund the government. Now, I say that, but at the same time, they are allowed still to issue revenue bonds, for an example, or issue things like capital project bonds. So if they're building a building and they need $50 million for it, they're allowed to issue bonds to pay for the building of that building. So they can go into debt for specific projects, but they can't go into debt to just like pay somebody's salary. But money's all fungible. So, how much does that really hold true? So anyway, so you have general funds. Like I said, sales tax, income tax, all goes there. You have the restricted fund. Now, these are monies that come from very specific places, generally speaking. So this would be like college tuition. So colleges and universities, state colleges and universities, those are state government entities. Their tuition is money that goes to the universities, but it falls into a restricted fund because it's not supposed to be used elsewhere. It's supposed to be used by that specific college tuition. But also what goes into this fund is things like occupational taxes, licensing taxes, those kinds of taxes that get charged to businesses on the licensure side, and fees to be a part of the boards or to keep up with that. That all goes into the restricted fund as well. And it's important you understand that source, okay? Next, you have the federal funds. Now, they have control to a degree over how these are spent. Of course, the federal dollars may be earmarked for specific items, but exactly the interpretation of those earmarks, what exactly those dollars will be spent on, what programs they'll be spent on, that is decided at the state level. So the federal government may set aside money to say you need to spend this on education for children. But they can decide if they're going to spend that on this or helping children to read. But they can decide exactly what that program looks like, exactly how they're going to spend it, but they don't have control over how much money is coming in. And then bond funds, once again, I mentioned this before, this is revenues that come from issuing bonds, normally to finance specific projects, construction projects particularly. Now, it's important to understand too, there's no such thing as free money. Now, when it comes to federal funds, technically speaking, if we're getting in more federal dollars than we're paying in, and Kentucky generally does, then that would mean that we are netting out, quote unquote, more money there. But at the same time, that is coming from a taxpayer's pocket. May not all be coming from Kentucky taxpayers' pockets, but it is coming from a taxpayer's pocket. But let's just put that aside for a second because we're discussing what the state exactly has control over. The state has no control over what your federal income tax is, for an example. So the state does have control over everything else. And once again, as I said, there's a balanced budget amendment. So outside of going into debt for specific construction projects, they have to get that money somewhere. So whether it's through the general fund, where they get it through direct taxation, or restricted funds, where they get it by essentially taxing specific individuals or through tuitions and fees. However, understand that that money is still a tax. This is something that goes over people's heads. This is something that the legislators require you to not understand for them to pull off their claims that they are cutting spending. Because once again, if the state cannot go into debt to spend money, every money they take from you has to be taxed somehow, some way, and the state also can't print money. Therefore, if they're spending it, they've taxed it from you some way. So if they are spending it out of the restricted fund, for an example, while that wasn't maybe a tax all of you paid directly, it is a tax you're paying through the cost of goods and services. Goods and services cost more when it's more expensive to do business. Simple fact. And so that government VIG that they get of those restricted funds, well, that is a VIG. It's just that. You have to pay it as the consumer. At some point down the line, the consumer is paying for it. Therefore, it is a tax through that lens. And of course, bond funds as well, we have to pay that back with interest. That's going to cost us more tax dollars down the road. And I bring all that up because when we start to actually look at the money and expenditures, we see a picture of how this 21% in additional spending is being spent. So, out of the general fund, okay, the average they spent 2 years ago was $15.03 billion. The average they're spending with this new budget is $15.49 billion, so about $500-ish million more, which, accounting for inflation, is essentially no increase. It definitely slows the rate when you look at what they increased it for last time. I think it was like 12-13%. But what's interesting is when you get to the restricted funds, you have $21.6 billion. In the last budget, in this budget, they're spending $26.9 billion on average a year. Federal funds went up only about $2-ish billion. Bond funds doubled. It went from an average of $2.2 billion a year 2 years ago in that budget to now $4.25 billion a year. So the net result in total spending, and there's some other funds in there, so this isn't all going to add up if you're trying to keep up with it, is $64.2 billion was our average per year total spending 2 years ago, and $75.5 billion this year. If we back out the federal increase of $2 billion, that's how we get that 21% increase in spending. And almost all of it is concentrated in the bond funds and restricted funds. Now, a chunk of those funds that out of the restricted fund, I believe, for an example, out of the insurance fund, they're sweeping, I believe it's $350 million out of that account and putting it into the budget reserve trust fund. So it shows up as like a quote unquote expenditure in the budget, but really they're not spending it yet. I'll return to that here in a second, what I mean by they're not spending it yet, but it is being swept over. So it shows up as a cost in the budget, but it's really not a cost, if that makes sense. So they're going to claim that they're spending less when really they're spending more. And if they have all this extra more in the restricted funds, that means they should be taking a look at those items and saying, where are we taxing citizens indirectly at a rate that's 20% higher than we were 2 years ago? What has happened? And an example might be if you're taxed on a percentage, right? So looking at the general fund, for example, if you're taxed on sales tax, 6%, but if inflation happens, you will see a growth in sales tax. You'll see a growth in the actual amount of money you are specifically paying in taxes. You will see a growth of that, even though the percentage didn't change. So you have to ask yourself, is it time to look at the percentages? Can we cut the percentages down? Or if we're afraid to, can we do some sort of non-wealth redistribution rebate on these taxes? Because clearly we've taken in too much. No good fiscal conservative says we should be spending 20% more year over year. Nobody says that if you're a good fiscal conservative. I know not all of these so-called Republicans are, but if you are, you should be saying that. But regardless, now somebody had asked me, well, if they're spending it, doesn't that mean we're being taxed it? It means we've historically been taxed it, but they could make a change in the future. They already have the money. However, they can make moves to make sure they don't keep having 20% more dollars to spend year after year after year to tamp down government spending. But we'll be discussing the goods, the bads. There's some good things, some bad things specifically within the budget. When we come back, the main takeaway I just want you to take there is while they may say, look, when you count for inflation, we cut the budget because of what the general fund says. They're not telling you about the, $5-6 billion they're spending more in restricted funds. They're not telling you about the twice amount of bond fund debt we're going into to pay for projects. They're not mentioning that, and I think that's important. We'll be discussing this more when we get back. We'll start talking about the goods, the bads, uglies. We'll have that here in just a few short minutes. Do you hear that? I do. It's Bashir crying. Why? Because you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And I thought to myself, why should we let those tears go to waste? Like any good capitalist, I said, that is a resource that can be sold. So we capture those tears from Andy Bashir and other famous tyrants like Pol Pot, Mao, whoever else. And we collect them up and we put them into a delicious coffee called Tyrant's Tears, available at brewed.store. Once again, that's brewed.store. You can pick yourself up a spiffy Andrew Cooperrider Show tumbler while you're at it. And get yourself a nice bag. Free shipping on orders over $85. We have Tyrant's Tears in 1776, our signature blends. We also have flavored coffees such as Swiss chocolate and bourbon for those of you that want a little kick without the buzz from, alcohol. You'll get the buzz from the caffeine, though. Check out today. Brewed.store. This is a Kentucky Proud product, roasted right in your own backyard. Brewed.store. Support the show. It's cheaper per pound than most of those other boutique coffees. And it's available whole bean, ground, K-Cups. However you make your coffee, we got you covered. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show discussing the budget, kind of rolled through the top line stats, some terminology there so you can understand exactly what legislators are saying when they're saying it, and you can question them a little bit better. But there are some things that was good in the budget overall. One of the things that we see here is they did take some steps to limit Beshear's extravagant travel on taxpayer dime. So, for an example, one of the things they put in there right off the bat that I really like, we should expand this to all dollars being spent, not just state aircraft, but they did add in the budget that any approval of state aircraft travel, notwithstanding KRS 45.101, 174.508, and any other statute or administrative regulation to the contrary, the use of state aircraft by any secretary or any other state official of any executive branch cabinet for out-of-state travel shall be approved by the state treasurer. The state treasurer shall only approve requests which document the use of the state aircraft that document that the use of the state aircraft is the lowest cost option as measured by both travel costs and travel time. The state treasurer shall not designate approval authority for out-of-state travel on state aircraft by executive branch cabinet secretaries or other state officials to any other person. Any requests and documentation regarding the use of state aircraft collected by the state treasurer shall be subject to the Kentucky Open Records Act. So there you go, right there off the bat saying, look, if you want to take the state planes out of state, for sure, you want to use the state planes for travel, you need to make sure you go to the treasurer and get that approved, and make sure too it's the lowest cost option. And they said time and cost, because understand, so if you're taking a state aircraft somewhere, let's say, and it's 6 people that it can take, or 5 people. Well, it's not just the cost of the plane tickets, but also their time. So if we as the taxpayer have to pay those 5 people that are making way too much, let's say $100,000 a year. So if they're making $100,000 a year, and you add up those people's time of going through airport security and airport and then catching a flight and everything else versus the cost of just putting them on a state plane, you end up saving money overall, which you could. Then that is a situation where you prove it, but also the reasoning has to be clearly demonstrated. And then, it doesn't specifically say they could deny if they don't like the reason. But, I think you could find some wiggle room in there. So I do like that a lot. Also, something else they did that I greatly appreciate is they went ahead and took a look at the governor's budget himself. So when you see these headlines about the governor suing the president, or the governor going ahead and fighting some lawsuit against Trump, or Trump's asking for documents, or the Trump administration's asking for something, and so he wants to fight about it. Well, that money to pay for that comes out of the governor's cabinet, his budget, and he has legal staff there. And so they did decrease, and also too, he can travel out of that budget as well. So they did decrease his office's budget by 8.6%. That's great. That's good. Keep reducing it. Say, hey, if you're going to be doing these things, if he does more of these things of suing and using those taxpayer dollars for that, then pull more out next time. However, they didn't include any limitations on using his office funds for suing the president or traveling out of state. So it's a workaround where if you say, okay, I have to get approval to travel out of state using taxpayer funds if I use a state aircraft. But if I don't use a state aircraft, well, in that case, I can travel without getting approval at all. It's a giant loophole. So there should be a limitation set on that. And also when it comes to I've never understood why the governor has lawyers on his staff that can sue the federal government. If a lawsuit needs to be brought on the behalf of Kentucky and Kentucky's taxpayers, we have a person who's elected to do specifically that, has a giant budget and an office full of attorneys. That person is Russell Coleman, the Attorney General. Now, some leftists might hear this and say, well, he would never sue Trump. He's too much of a bootlicker. Because that's their new favorite term. The very people who had, no problem using government entities to go after their political opponents and lock up, January 6th protesters and everything else are now suddenly all concerned with people being bootlickers. But regardless, Russell Coleman will do whatever he thinks the voters would approve of him doing. That's the thing about elected people. They only care about three things: getting elected, staying elected, getting elected to higher office. That is their entire motivation. And so if the voters want him to sue the administration, he will sue them if he thinks it's good for the voters. If, however, he thinks it's bad for the voters, that the voters wouldn't like him for doing it, then he won't do it. And this might sound extremely shallow to some people. They might be like, he should just do it based upon principle or not principle or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's a good of a motivation of any, because if he believes that the voters would be mad at him for expending their funds on a lawsuit, then that means that he would be spending the money of the taxpayer. If he went ahead with that lawsuit, he'd be wasting taxpayer funds on projects they don't agree with. It's their money, not his money. It makes a whole lot of sense. But regardless, they didn't put any riders in for that. And then on the other side of things, one of the places he's also been using to fund his travels is, of course, economic development. His travels overseas, he's been calling them economic development trips and using the economic development cabinet funds to go ahead and pay for that. There is no riders in the economic development's budget to say you cannot use economic development funds for travel overseas. There's no riders in there saying that if the governor needs to travel overseas, he can fund it out of his own budget. He doesn't need to be using economic development funds. However, they did pass a budget that reduces the economic development cabinet's budget by 4.5%. So while they didn't put those controls on the funds that I would like to see, leaving it still open for Beshear to go ahead and misuse and abuse state taxpayer funds, especially for his, his attempt at running for president. What it does do is it does reduce that budget, meaning, maybe it tightens it up a bit where they don't have as much money for him to be running around and, doing those extravagant things that he loves to do on the taxpayer's dime. There's a few other places where they've increased funding, while decreasing in other places. For an example, they did increase funding through K through 12 education. So when you hear all the K through 12 education people wringing their hands saying, oh, we don't have money, they're not spending more. Actually, over the budget, the 2 years, they're spending an additional $370 million on education. Now, granted, that's kind of a black pit. They'll ask, well, are teachers going to get raises? Well, you could take that $369 million and use it for teachers' raises. They also are giving, I believe, a 2% raise to state employees. Now, some people are like, well, why can't they give the raise to the teachers? I've talked about this before, but it's just unconstitutional. Once again, and I talked about what our Constitution says about funding, giving a direct raise to the teachers, unconstitutional. We'll discuss that when we get back. We'll discuss more about the budget here in a few minutes. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll see you back here in a few short minutes. Delicious. Oh, what's in here? Oh, well, what's in my tumbler here, the Andrew Cooperrider Show tumbler, available for sale at brewed.store, is 1776, a brewed coffee, a Kentucky proud product that's roasted right here in Kentucky, of course. You can pick yourself up a bag at brewed.store. Free shipping on orders over $85. And they're sold in per pound, both ground, whole bean, and K-cups. If you like your little K-Cup machines, we have that for you too. And the best part is per pound, it's cheaper than most of the boutique freedom-loving coffees out there. And this one's made right here in your own backyard. I know that's fantastic. So pick yourself up. We've got 1776, a French roasted dark blend, which is historically funny because, of course, the French financed the revolution. And then also we have one of our other signature blends, Tyrant's Tears, a coffee that we meticulously harvest from famous tyrants like Andy Bashir, Pol Pot, and, of course, Mao. Additionally, we have other single origin coffees such as Cameroon Pea Berry, Kenya, Peru. Fantastic, fantastic blends. Go ahead and pick yourself up a bag today. Not only will you be supporting the show, but also you'll be putting in your mouth a delicious and tasty black nectar called coffee. So order yours today. Brewed.store. Once again, it's BREWED.store. Brewed.store. Free shipping. Orders over $85. Pick yourself up a bag and pick yourself up one of these spiffy tumblers. Andrew Cooperrider Show tumbler today. Once again, that's brewed.store. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Final segment here. Been discussing the budget. So before the break, I was mentioning how state employees see a 2% raise. And while education over the 2 years is getting a several $100 million increase in spending, it still won't be enough for many of the crazed liberals. When it comes to our education, when it comes to our schooling, understand right now in the state of Kentucky, the average school district is spending over $19,000 a student. Over $19,000 a student, $19,020 to be specific, a student for the 2024-2025 school year. When you look back at the per pupil funding from 21 to 22, the amount was $16,422. So over the course of those, 3 years, spending per pupil within the state increased by 15.8%. 15.8%. Did teachers get a 15.8% raise? Regardless if you think whether they deserve it or don't deserve it, and there's a lot of arguments because, of course, people look at the results out of public schools and say, look, they're not doing a very good job. And I understand that argument too as well. But put all that to the side. Let's just pretend if you're somebody who believes teachers deserve a raise. And I know it's a big argument, and but let's just pretend. Asking the state to, in their budget, line item a raise for the teachers, first off, it's unconstitutional. The way the state constitution is wrote, and it's one of the only other provisions that talk about spending outside of the balanced budget, is that the state has to provide equitable funding for education across the state. Now, you have districts like JCPS and Fayette County Public Schools, where they're paying, their average teachers $50, $60K a year. Sometimes more. And then you have rural districts where it's lower, maybe around $45,000 or so. And so if the budget just said, okay, all teachers, I think Bashir once promised 11% raise to all school employees. So if the state legislature sat down and said, okay, 11% raise going to every teacher, well, that would create an unequitable funding difference. Because some districts would get significantly more than other districts. Because at the end of the day, it is the district that makes the decision on what to pay the teachers. They are employees of that district. They are not state employees. Sure, their retirements and their insurances is handled by the state to create a larger pool of people. They put all of them in. But their actual decision-making on hired and how much you're going to get paid, what's your rate pay, that is decided at the district level, not at the state level. All the state can do, all the governments can do is provide, once again, more funding to these school districts. And when you consider their property tax increases, their increased funding from the state government, last budget, they also gave them hundreds of millions or more. Funding from federal government's going up. When you consider all those things, they are spending on total per pupil 15.8% more. over 3 years. If you're a teacher and you didn't get a 15.8% raise over those years, your problem isn't with the state. Your problem is with your district. Your district made that decision. And you can't claim, well, inflation sucked that all up. No. 15.8% across the board. So if inflation did go up and everything went up 15.8% in increased costs, then your salary should have went up 15.8%. Because they increased it, it would have been increased across the board. That's how percentages work, right? It would mean that inflation would have had to have sucked up 25% of the money of the increase. Would have had to have gone up 25% on all other items, but teachers raise or whatever it works out to be in each individual district. But they decided not to. Instead, they decided to spend it on other things than giving that 15.8% raise. Why? It's the same reason why they always fund the roads last. You see, roads is one of the few things we all agree that government should do and do well. And to some people, they all agree that education in the education world, that hot button issue of paying teachers more, it's a third rail issue. If you disagree with it, all hate upon you. The most hate I've ever gotten, ever on a post, is when I said something about how a elementary school art teacher shouldn't be paid the same amount as a high school physics teacher just because they've been working for the district the same amount of time. They also shouldn't have the same degrees. They also shouldn't have the same certifications. One is clearly a lot more difficult of a subject to teach, high school level physics, than it is to teach, finger painting to kids, but whatever. So much hate, so many messages about it. I just got a message from somebody earlier this week because I had posted something about the fact that the governor's lying to you when he claims we want to see these increases, but those mean old Republicans. I got an angry message about how I'm wrong or something, or how because I didn't specifically say teachers do deserve the raise, I just asked the question, they've increased spending 15.8%. Did teachers get a 15.8% raise? And I pointed out it was unconstitutional. That made me enemy number one. So I get it. It's a third rail issue. You don't want to talk about it. And so because they beat you over the head with this idea, teachers aren't paid enough, they're not paid enough, they're not paid enough. Same thing is roads. They beat you over the head. They're not paid enough. They're not paid. There's not enough. The roads, we need better roads. We need more money for the roads. If we don't tax you more, how are you going to get better roads? Because they're items that we all agree on, because they are items that, not all, but because they are items that, generally speaking, large swaths of the taxpayer base says, yes, that's something I'm okay with my money being spent on, it will be the last thing they actually spend money on because they can't continue to use it as a club to get more money out of you. And teachers need to wise up to this fact. They're going to be taken for a ride by Democrats, by Bashir, by lies. Just lies. About how, Republicans hate teachers because they've refused to give the school districts more money or they won't give teachers raises. They literally can't. It's not their decision to make. That's your district's decision to make. Regardless, it does increase, though, educational spending. Also, it does increase, too, school safety spending, too, as well. It also had an increase in a moderate increase in spending there. Now, across the board, everybody got about 2-3% cut. They did make that cut. However, like I said, those restricted funds and those bond spending made our budget overall increase 20%. And that is what I really wish we could sit down and have a heart-to-heart with legislators about when it comes to spending. And I know it's something they don't want to talk about because part of it is they really don't understand it. I've talked to a lot of legislators about that restricted fund, about that additional spending, about where's that coming from, about how do we cut those taxes, about how do we lower the cost for people. This is coming out of the taxpayer's pocket. And a lot of them struggle to understand exactly where these funds come from and exactly how they would go about cutting dollars from these funds. Now, perhaps they identified this for study. Now, like I said, they did sweep $350 million out of that restricted fund into the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. I do want to mention that before I finish up. There will be another budget. There will be another bill, I guarantee you, where they spend money on one-time items. That will be the pork bill, the really, really pork-filled bill. It will have a laundry list of items. The last time they did this 2 years ago, they passed a budget bill, and then they had a one-time spending bill that didn't count as part of the budget because they didn't want it to count so they could, continue to reduce taxes but continue to spend like drunken sailors at the same time. And in there, they had all kinds of junk. I mean, in there, they had like $1.5 million for a Louisville Opera House who didn't need the money, was in the positive, had millions of dollars in the bank, and is teaching, social justice rap. Got $1.5 million. A soundstage in Louisville got millions of dollars in that. And we'll likely see another pork-filled bill. So as they say, well, we're sweeping that $350 million to the Budget Reserve Trust Fund, so we're not really spending it. Well, you do have plans to spend it, though. You do on pork. I mean, one of the items in there, $150 million for a life science center in Northern Kentucky. That was another item benefiting one specific legislator's husband who part-owned the business. But anyways, so be on the lookout for that bill. We'll be looking for it, going through all the pork that'll be in it because we know it will be, and it will get ugly on that one, trust me. A lot of the legislators that like me may not, but we'll see. Well, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Till next time, we will be seeing you.